Hi, my name is Greg Campbell, Chief Architect at Acaveo. Today I want to walk you through a basic installation and configuration of the DataClassifier for SharePoint 2013 product. The basic steps I'm going to walk you through are as follows. First, we'll configure the prerequisites. Next, we'll install the DataClassifier for SharePoint 2013 product. And finally, we'll perform some initial configuration. Let's begin. The first prerequisite is that you have a SQL Server 2008 R2 or later instance on which you'll house the DataClassifier application database. This database will be extremely small and it will place virtually no load on whatever SQL Server you choose, so it's entirely appropriate to use any existing SQL Server in your environment. In my case, I typically use the SQL Server being used by SharePoint in my environment. That's entirely appropriate. The next prerequisite is a domain account for the DataClassifier service to run under. And there's a few requirements for this account. So once you've created an Active Directory, you need to make sure that it has the following. The first thing is that it needs to be a member of the administrators group on your SharePoint 2013 server where you're going to be installing the DataClassifier product. So in my environment, if I switch over to that SharePoint 2013 server, which is gregdevg, I switch to that machine and I take a look at my administrators group. You'll see that I've already added an account to here named svc_DataClassifier. That's the service account that we're going to choose for the DataClassifier product. The next prerequisite for the DataClassifier service account is that it has to have the permissions to act as the PowerShell administrator against your search administration database. So basically there's a PowerShell command that you need to run, which you can see here, which will grant the account, in this case SVC DataClassifier, the appropriate permission. So in this environment I've already gone, I've logged in as an existing SharePoint administrator, and I've run this command from the SharePoint management shell to grant the privilege. The next thing required for the DataClassifier service account is the DB creator role on whatever SQL Server you've chosen to house the DataClassifier application database. This isn't strictly required. Makes your installation process a little simpler, but you also have the option of manually creating a database and then assigning the SVC DataClassifier account permission to just that database moving forward. So for example, if you were housing this on a production SharePoint or a production SQL Server that was housing SharePoint and you aren't comfortable granting DB creator role to another account, there is a way of operating with fewer privileges. And the final thing that you need to make sure that the DataClassifier service account has is read permission to all of the content that you'll be evaluating policies against. So typically all of the content that you're indexing with your SharePoint environment, you need to make sure that the DataClassifier service account has access to it. So for file shares, this is pretty easy. You just have to make sure that SVC DataClassifier would have read access to all of those file shares. And for SharePoint content, the easiest way to grant that privilege, if I jump back over to my SharePoint environment and I go to the web application management, you can see I have a fairly simple environment. I only have one web application, and if I just select that web application and go to the user policies, you'll see I've already configured a user policy that gives the DataClassifier service account full read permission. So that means anything in this web application and any of the site collections underneath will have read permission to. Okay, once you've done all of that, you are essentially ready to log in as the DataClassifier service account and perform the installation. So now if I jump back over to my SharePoint server, 2013 server, you'll see I'm in fact already logged in as the SVC DataClassifier user account, and so I'm good to just go ahead and perform the installation. So I've previously downloaded the latest version, latest build of DataClassifier. So I just click on the zip package. Inside of that zip package there's the install and config guide as well as the user guide and then the installer MSI. So I'll just run the installer and I'll hit next, and I'll read and accept the terms of license agreement, and then I will specify my database connection string. So this is the first thing that DataClassifier needs to know, and that is, what is the application database? So by default, if you're installing this into a new environment, you just let the installer create a new database for you. So really the only thing you need to do is point it to your SQL Server. In this case, gregdevd is my SQL Server. And then I can just select to create a new database. And I'll accept the default database name. And so the installer will go ahead, it'll create the database for you. I'll just accept that. And I can validate that that operation was successful, and then continue. And then the next thing that I need to provide is the service account. So in this case, that's gregdev svc _ DataClassifier. That was the account that we'd set up. Okay, and we'll just validate that. Okay, we can continue, and then we just provide the installation directory. Default is fine, and we begin the installation. So that should install the product, and it'll start the services up. And if I go and look now at the services that I have running on this machine, there should be a couple of new services for Acaveo DataClassifier. Okay, so they're both running, and the first one is just Acaveo DataClassifier. That's our basic DataClassifier service. And then the second service is the Content Enrichment Web Service, and this is the integration point into the 2013 indexing process. So that's running as well. So at this point, we have the product installed, and we're ready to go ahead and launch the UI and perform the initial configuration. So let me go ahead and launch the DataClassifier console. And I'll just take a second to load up, and then it is possible to run the console remotely. In this case, obviously, we're on the same machine where we locally installed DataClassifier. And so in that case, when it comes up and it prompts me which machine I want to connect to, I can accept the default local host, and I can just say connect. And so it'll initially load some information, some licensing information. Typically, instead of seeing you have 13 days remaining, you would see you have 30 days remaining if this was the first time you've installed the DataClassifier trial into your environment. And once you purchase a production license, then obviously there'd be no days counting down. So really, there's only one piece of information that you need to configure before you can jump right into creating your policies. And that is if you go to the configuration node, there's the search service URL. So this needs to be provided so that DataClassifier is able to run searches against your environment for things like policy stats, and there's also a searching capability that's built into the product that uses this as well. And often it's as simple as simply entering in the name of one of your SharePoint web front ends. So as long as you have a web app running on port 80 under the root, that would be sufficient. In my case, that's actually not the case in this environment, so I need to manually specify a valid URL. So I know that I have a SharePoint site that's running at gregdevg sites Acaveo. And so I can just validate that that's a valid URL. And so that passed, so I can just go ahead and apply those changes. And this is the point at which I would just go ahead and start creating my policy. So we've installed the product, it's configured. And so for a walkthrough on how to create those policies and actually get those policies applied against your content, watch the next video.